Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield audio podcast.
I want you to remember the words Hollingsworth v. Perry. Probably haven't heard those words exactly in that form before, Hollingsworth v. Perry. But this is the name of the current case the Supreme Court is considering on gay rights and gay marriage. It is likely to end up ranking with some of the great Supreme Court decisions in the history of America. Marbury v. Madison, Engel v. Vitale. These are extremely important cases, really epic cases. And I think right now the U.S. Supreme Court might very well be considering a case that will change our country profoundly. And I want to talk about it from a legal perspective. I want to talk about it from a Christian perspective. And I want to talk about it from a cultural perspective here just for a few minutes with you. You probably know where this case came from. Remember that all Supreme Court cases arise from lower courts. They don't just sort of appear before the Supreme Court, without a history. And so what happened was that the California Supreme Court some years ago essentially issued a ruling that allowed for gay marriage. Well, the people in California are an unusual bunch. And I say that knowing a lot of Californians are listening, because in the South, they tend to be fairly urban and liberal. It's sort of LA culture, but the majority of California is more like Northern California, which is like West Texas. It's more farm and ranch, and it's more conservative. So California has an unusual political history and style. So what happened was California State Supreme Court essentially legalized gay marriage, and then a movement among the voters evolved this famous Proposition 8 that you heard about. And if you listened some time ago to my various podcasts about Mormonism, you know that the Mormons really plowed in behind this Proposition 8, because Proposition 8 essentially was a voter movement to nullify the Supreme Court's ruling. In other words, to ban gay marriage in California. So let's be clear. The state Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. The voters initiated a movement to ban gay marriage, and that proposition won. Well, we knew that proposition would be appealed. It would be reviewed by courts. And sure enough, a federal judge in San Francisco ruled Proposition 8 unconstitutional. That got appealed up to the Ninth Circuit Court, and that court also upheld the federal judge's ruling that Proposition 8 was unconstitutional. So obviously, all of this was going to end up before the Supreme Court, which, by the way, was the intention of some of the attorneys filing these appeals to begin with. So finally, you have this whole issue of whether gay marriage can be outlawed even by a voter's initiative appearing before the Supreme Court. And at the same time, the Supreme Court decided to hear this case, which again bears the name Hollingsworth v. Perry. You have other cases that are sort of like it, an inheritance case between two lesbians in New York, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a number of appeals all coming together, and the court has finally decided we've got to make a ruling about this. Now, here is what I expect will happen. It's very important for you to understand that this case will not legalize, so to speak, gay marriage in America. That's not what it will do. What it will do is bans on gay marriage. So what it will actually functionally do, administratively do, is roll these decisions back to the states. The Supreme Court is not going to legalize gay marriage. That's not within the purview of what they have under review. The Supreme Court is going to disallow bans on gay marriage. And some of you know enough to know that this means that the Supreme Court will essentially overrule DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which has been around for a decade or more, and essentially established marriage between a man and a woman as the only legal form of marriage in America. So in one fell swoop, purely as a matter of review, the court is going to ban bans. It's going to say you cannot outlaw gay marriage, number one. And then it's going to, as a result, overthrow DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which has governed federal policy for about a decade and a half. And where that's going to leave us is with no national law relating to the definition of marriage. And that means it's going to be rolled back to the states, which, by the way, is where it should be to begin with. And so if all that happens, unless something unusual happens, Congress steps in and passes a federal law, whatever, which is very unlikely, what we're likely to end up with is what probably the Founding Fathers intended to begin with, and that is that these major moral/religious sort of cultural issues would be decided at the state level. That you would have, for example, certain church practices legalized in one state, maybe not in another, or certain moral practices legalized in one state and not in another. And I need to say that even though that bothers many of us who might disagree with what some states might do, like let's say legalizing abortion, or let's say there's somebody listening now who doesn't believe that blacks and whites ought to marry, well, those things would have been decided at a state-by-state level, and you would have been happy with what some states decided, not happy with what other states decided. The broader point is this is what the Founding Fathers intended. Quite frankly, had the Supreme Court been functioning according to the original Constitution, we would not have had a law called Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in all 50 states. We would have had a law that allowed the states to decide for themselves. And to this day, we would have a patchwork of laws across the country. You can be sure that probably Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi and maybe Florida and Texas would have outlawed abortion, but you can be very sure that New York and California, et cetera, would have allowed abortion, and people would just cross state lines to get abortions. But it would allow the states to rule on these issues as they felt the locality required. So that's what should have happened with abortion. That's what should have happened on some other issues, and it's likely to happen now in Hollingsworth v. Perry. Now, that means we're heading into an era in which gay marriage, marriage between people of the same gender, will be allowed in certain states. It will functionally then be legal in America in the sense that these people aren't being rounded up and jailed, and it's legal within certain states. It will not be allowed in other states. And we will have that patchwork that I've been talking about, which, again, is what the Founding Fathers intended. In fact, on the matter of religion, that's exactly what we had at the moment the Founding Fathers penned the Constitution. How are people like me, if I may make it personal for a moment, who love my gay friends, know a lot of gay people, have pastored many, many gay people, not angrily, ragingly anti-gay, and yet I'm a traditional Christian. I do believe that homosexuality is a sinful lifestyle. And I want to quickly add, like a lot of other lifestyles, I've got friends who are alcoholics. I've got friends who are violent in their homes. I've got friends who have porn problems. All those are sinful lifestyles. So, am I willing to love and befriend people who engage in lifestyles I consider to be sinful? Yes, absolutely, without question. The issue is, how do we function at a political level? How do people like me, Christians, traditional Christians, who see homosexuality as a sinful matter, but nevertheless love my gay friends, love homosexuals, not as a class, but the ones I know, and yet would talk them out of their lifestyle if I could, and have, and do. And all of my gay friends know that we're going to have those conversations. How do we live in this patchwork world? Well, I want to say something to you that may sound rather radical. And that is that I fear more the expansion of government into private lives and the overreach of government into the private lives of citizens more than I do a gay couple down the street living out their gay lives. In other words, I've already stated what I believe about homosexuality, but as a present political reality, I am far more concerned about the overreach of government than I am about how gays might be conducting themselves legally in America. I'll change hearts and minds as I can, and that's possible, that's doable. But right now, my biggest concern in America, other than just the wrath of God over how we conduct ourselves, is the dramatic overreach of the federal government particularly, and the intrusion of government into our lives. So it's my view that what Christians in particular and people of traditional values ought to be working for at this point is what I call a libertarian society. Limited government, checks on government, protections for our private lives. Government can't read our emails, can't get into our bank accounts, can't tap our phones, et cetera, under some assumed military posture. And if we have a libertarian society that guarantees checks on government and individual freedoms, even freedoms I might not agree with, then there's greater protection for churches, greater protection for individual Christian believers like me or people of other faiths who are of traditional faiths, and a greater opportunity for the marketplace of ideas to be used to change hearts and minds. I'm pro-life. I'm not pro-abortion. So I use the free market to change hearts and minds. I don't want my values to be dominant in the society. I don't want a pro-abortion stance to be dominant. I want a free market of ideas and government checked. And even though that means that gay people will be allowed to marry, something I'm not in favor of, I would rather have that legalized in our society than to continue to hand to federal government the power to control down to the very last detail of the moral choices of citizens. That's going to hurt us in the long run, and it's going to hurt people of traditional faith, perhaps most of all. So where am I? I am, as a matter of values, opposed to homosexuality and gay marriage, no question about that, loving my gay friends along the way. And as a matter of public policy, I want to see government checked. I want to see people with the maximum individual freedoms. And then I'll go to work trying to change hearts and minds with the gospel that I believe and the values that I hold to. That's how it ought to work. So, folks listening of traditional values, you're likely to live in a society in which gay marriage is legal in some states, not legal in others. I think that's preferable to living in a state where the government mandates these things, even in a way that you would like. Because if they have the authority to mandate moral issues in a way you would like, trust me, it can always boomerang, and they can mandate moral issues in a way you will not like. So, limited government, rule of law, marketplace of ideas, and then win hearts and minds for your values. That's how it ought to work. So get ready for Hollingsworth v. Perry, very likely to be the landmark case on gay marriage.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, a frequent faith and culture commentator on CNN, Fox, and Huffington Post. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Faith of Barack Obama, The Search for God in Guinness, and Lincoln's Battle with God. You can learn more about Stephen at mansfieldgroup.com and connect with him on Facebook and on Twitter under the name Mansfield Writes. The Stephen Mansfield podcast is produced by Isaac Darnell, who also wrote, performed, and produced the Rockin' and Rollin' podcast theme song. This is a Chartwell Literary Group production.